Welcome back to the Invest in Yourself podcast. Today I'm joined by author/attorney Kerrie Droban. Today we talk about Kerrie's book named Running with the Devil. This is a book about a group of undercover agents infiltrating a motorcycle club. She has written quite a few books about biker clubs, both from the law enforcement perspective and the criminal perspective, the guys that were actually in that life. Kerrie's book will be in the video description. I highly recommend it. Please subscribe to my channel for more interviews like this, and without further ado, let's get into Kerrie's story. Good morning, Kerrie. How you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing great.
Thank you for coming on my show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
I really enjoyed your book, Running with the Devil, the true crime story. I mean, a lot of people that watch my show, we do a lot of the mafia stuff, but today I really wanted to cover some, biker stuff. And you covered a whole book about it, about some ATF agents infiltrating the Hells Angels and some other groups. So, how did you get involved with writing this book?
Well, it's interesting. It's sort of a story within a story, but and it's interesting that you cover a lot of mafia subjects because I've always regarded the motorcycle clubs as sort of the mafia on wheels. It's run very similarly structurally. So I got involved in this book actually because I was asked to write it when I first was approached by the operatives, the ATF agents involved in the Operation Black Biscuit. They approached me. I'm a lawyer, and I had been a fiction writer before I got into this, never wrote true crime before. And they approached me and said, how would you like to write a book about infiltration into the Hells Angels? And my first response was, hell no. like I didn't know anything about them. I was not going to touch a territory that I knew nothing about. And so they were very persistent. And by the third time that they asked me, I finally rolled the dice and I said yes. But I didn't realize what I was getting involved in because it was an odyssey is the best way to describe it. So the whole operation lasted 18 months, and the writing of the book actually took about that long. And so while they were undercover, I was actually undercover writing it because that's a whole other saga. But in order to write their story, they approached me and said, hey, we're involved in the first ever infiltration of the Arizona Hells Angels. And this is going to be a landmark criminal investigation. And it turned out to be that. It was monumental, it was experimental, improvisational, I mean, you name it. And the writing of it was the same way because I had to sort of be in the role of an undercover writer to, ask them questions about their investigation. It was an ongoing investigation. So here I was, a lawyer, thinking, this book is going to be the end of my law career. It's going to be the end of my writing career. It's going to be the end of my marriage. I mean, all these things. And yet I rolled the dice anyway and I wrote it.
Damn. No, I mean that is interesting. I didn't know that you did it as the whole investigation was going. I mean, so these guys, they would just feed you information, they'd meet up with you or while they were on undercover?
Yeah. So the lead operative, Jay Dobbins, met with me in sort of in secret. And one of the rules that we had was nothing could be in writing, nothing could be recorded. I had to take notes, like sort of on sticky notes, legal pads. And, because I'm a lawyer, I record everything, I mean, that's just kind of what I do. And so I was sort of thinking, well, I'm approaching this role as an investigative journalist to learn about not only investigation, but the Hells Angels, which, at the time I knew nothing about. So I would meet him in, parking garages. I'd meet him in hotel rooms. It was a very clandestine, weird experience. And he would tell me his story. And so, the interesting thing about this is when I started writing it, there really wasn't any other book other than Billy Queen's book, Under and Alone, where he infiltrated the Mongols. It was the only book that was out there like this. And so I really didn't have a lot of reference materials. I mean, I had Hunter Thompson's book on Hells Angels, but it's not like you can go to the library and look this stuff up. So all of it was investigation. It was all interviews. It was like trying to get corroboration for the information that I was receiving. And so, the story itself that is memorialized in Running with the Devil it's like a story within a story. And I mean, it's a very intriguing, interesting case. And it's actually been a case that other law enforcement agencies study now for kind of what went wrong and what not to do. Because, the operatives themselves will be the first to tell you it was very improvisational because they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how to infiltrate the Hells Angels. I didn't know how to write about it. They didn't know how to infiltrate it. So it was sort of like we were all learning on the same playing field. But it was very exciting, very nerve wracking, very risky in a lot of
Yeah.
respects.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah, because I mean, being able to do this while they're ongoing, I mean, that's something else. You don't really ever, hear about that. Usually years after they'll come out and tell their story and stuff. And I believe you said Jay Dobbins, he did go on and write his own book as well. So
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
yeah, so I mean, it transpired into a whole lot of different, stories, and coming out with there's a lot of different biker stories and guys coming out
Yeah.
now, and different areas of it. But that's really cool that that was how you got into it. It's very interesting. I've never heard something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the operatives knew when they were doing this that it was really an extraordinary thing that they were doing because, and I think that's why they approached me while it was ongoing. It's sort of like, writing a crime story before the dead body appears. It's like you're like anticipating what's going to happen. And so it was a little dicey, because I didn't know where the investigation was going. And I had to be mindful as a lawyer not to um, ruin or interfere with the first ever prosecutions of, you know, leading Hell's Angels. I mean, they were going after RICO charges, and of course that didn't materialize. But that was always in the back of my mind, like, how am I going to not, screw this up for the prosecuting agencies, and how am I going to keep the cover of the operatives that were still involved? Because, I they were undercover, and P.S. it's a crime to sell your story while you're still involved in an ongoing operation. So there was a lot of tension and risk involved in bringing this story to life.
I would imagine so, but I mean, I think you ended up doing a pretty good job navigating through all that, and
Thank you.
now it's been out there for quite some years now. So, if you want, we can go into it and talk about the characters that were involved, the operatives, and eventually we'll go into the, how they got their in with the Hell's Angels.
Yeah.
So, who were some of the operatives that I had approached you?
So Jay Dobbins, who is the leading operative, really sort of was recruited by a character named Beef in the story, and Beef was his case agent, his manager, if you will, his handler, um, and he recruited him really sort of because of his reputation. And Jay had another persona that he was kind of putting forth in Bullhead City. He was working on a completely different case, and he had a persona as an arms trafficker, kind of this bat wielding, you know, taking care of business kind of person. And so Beef had this idea that he was going to um, create a team and they were going to go after the Hells Angels. And they really didn't have much more information than that. And so when Jay came on board, they recruited another, police officer, they recruited an informant because they needed somebody that kind of, be the fall guy in case they needed it. So none of these people that they recruited really had a ton of experience, and they certainly didn't have any experience infiltrating the Hells Angels. So it was very new, very improvisational. They didn't quite know how they were going to do it. And so they created the important thing that they did was they created these personas. They had to stick as close to the truth as possible so that they wouldn't get caught, but they had to live and embody these personas 24/7. So that was the real kicker of being undercover, was that you lived this double life, and living this double life was life or death. So the minute you broke character or came out of that, you, you were going to, you could face the possibility of being killed. So, some of these operatives had families. Jay had a family. And so you had to be really careful how you were going to navigate that world of being deep undercover and also, infiltrating a pretty violent biker gang. So that's how the group sort of formulated. And So their first sort of foray into this was, how are they going to get inside? Because the whole idea was, if they could gain the trust of one of the leaders of the Hells Angels, then they could get inside and they could start to gather intelligence. So that was sort of the beginning part of this plot to do this. But again, because they didn't really know what they were doing, they didn't have a lot of expectations. So I think that was part of it. So they were rehearsing their parts, rehearsing their personas, and then wound up targeting or infiltrating the Mesa Hells Angels chapter, and Mesa Bob, who was the head of that.
Yeah, and they're into that, or the informant was Rudy, right?
Yes, Rudy the informant. And they had many issues with Rudy the informant. But so one of the interesting things about handling an informant is, you have to, you put them out there, but there's a certain level where you don't want to lose control of them. They're the ones that are going to, do the infiltration, maybe take some of the tests that the Hells Angels are going to, give to the new recruits. But they didn't want Rudy, committing crimes on their watch. So it was a little bit of, straddling the fence. How do you manage somebody and make sure that they toe the line, and how do you, get them out when you need to?
Right. And Rudy, he was, and the way that, I don't know if this is the way that he got busted or they got him to cooperate, was that he had killed a woman by chopping her head off, right? And then he was, was that how they got him to flip?
uh, how they got him to quit, or how they got
So
him in?
how they got him to flip, becoming like an informant, or like how did
Oh,
they even get this with him?
yeah. Well, so a lot of ways that they will recruit informants is they're working off time. So they're either going to spend the rest of their life in prison, or they're going to help, a government agency. And so that's typically the way informants come into the game.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I mean he made the introduction though with one of the leaders though, didn't Rudy? And that's how they got their in with the message group.
Right. So they used Rudy to get inside Mesa Bob's clubhouse. And so Rudy was, very authentic, obviously, because, that's who he was. He was already a criminal. And he gave them the credibility, the street credibility, to get inside the clubhouse. And so once they were inside, in that inner sanctum with Mesa Bob, it was much easier for them to navigate their, their foray into other areas. Now, getting inside involves several steps. So the first step that they was to be prospects. So when you're prospecting a club, you're on a probation period. Basically, you have to be sponsored by somebody in the club, and so Mesa Bob was becoming their sponsor. So when they prospect, they're given all kinds of menial tasks. They have to kind of be on call 24/7. They have to pass certain tests, some of which can be, they want to make sure that these are not undercover officers, right? So there are all kinds of tests that they're going to give their prospects. And so the prospecting period can last anywhere from a month to however long it takes. So that was one of the interesting early problems in this case. Was, okay, so now that they're, now that they're going to prospect for this Mesa chapter, now that they have a camaraderie with Mesa Bob, how are they going to move on up the chain, right? So that was sort of how are they going to pass all of these tests and, gather intel? And so one of the problems early on in this was the tests of women. So the Hells Angels would, offer up women, and women have their own hierarchy in the club. The pass arounds, the old ladies, the mamas, the property of certain people. And so that became a problem for Jay and some of the other, undercover operatives, because they didn't want to bed down these women. They had their own, their own wives, their lives. I mean, this was not something they were gonna, come on board with. So that became kind of a problem early on that they did not anticipate. And so one of the reasons this story is so interesting, well, many of the reasons, but one of the reasons is they had to figure out a way that they were going to pass this test. How were they going to convince the Hells Angels that they didn't need to bed down all these women? So one was they wound up recruiting women to play the role of Dobbin's old lady. So once you have an old lady or they're property of, now, other women are off limits. So that became an interesting process. And, it took several tries for him to find the right female recruit.
Yeah, and wasn't her name JJ, her nickname?
Yes, her name
Yeah.
was JJ or Jenna.
Jenna, yeah.
And she was a fresh recruit, had never done undercover work before. And she came in and, of course, had to assume the persona, the role of being Jay's old lady, and did an amazing job and gathered, kind of unsuspectingly, gathered a whole bunch of intelligence from the women who were involved in the Hells Angels. And so that was kind of interesting, too, because for the first time you realize that a lot of the women did some of the dirty work for the Hells Angels. They would take the fall in a lot of the crimes. They would wind up in positions where they could gather information. Some of them were dispatchers, where they wound up, right inside, they sort of spy on each other, so you've got the women in the dispatcher intel part of police departments gathering intelligence. You have women that are hiding weapons or drugs for, their members, taking the fall. So, there's this whole interior intelligence that that JJ was able to acquire. So it became a really interesting kind of almost double infiltration.
Yeah, it really did because they are two different, things to get involved with because the women do other things and then the guys do their own things, because the women they were not treated as well. You know what I mean? Like from the book, you'd said that they were passed around and just treated like crap. And
Mhm.
so, I mean, for JJ, how did she navigate through that, or did she give you any information on how she? Because this was 18 months, and she was not
Right.
used to any of this stuff at all.
Right. Well, JJ not only looked the part, but had the personality. She was an absolute, like, perfect fit for this role. And she embraced this character to the point where she not only endeared herself to the women in the Hells Angels, but also to the men. And so she was, in my opinion, I think in a lot of ways, she was the catalyst for this investigation, because had she not been pulled in, Jay would have had that continuous problem of how was he going to, convince the Hells Angels that he wasn't interested in women. That was not even an option. He had to be interested in women. That was part of the whole persona of the game.
Right.
So I think she saved the day in that respect. But in another respect, not only could she gather intelligence and also kind of chummy up to, the members, which was hugely valuable for the investigation, but on another level, it posed some other interesting problems because they needed to make sure that she was safe, right? So they had to have almost double eyes on these operatives as they started to get deeper and deeper into the infiltration. So they had to not only watch over and surveil the male operatives, but now they had to worry about the female operative, because there were many instances where the two did not align. They went their separate ways. So it became a sort of a logistical nightmare for the people behind the scenes. So it was a very interesting and difficult investigation for that reason.
Yeah, and after they made this with her getting involved and them getting more deeper in, what was the next steps of the investigation after they had gotten her in there pretty good, and the other, Jay and the other guys that were involved, their nicknames were Bird, and they had Pops was another character that was involved,
Yeah,
Schmitty and
possibly
stuff. So I
another.
mean, I don't want to fast forward, but I mean, kind of after that, after they were pretty good in there, where did the investigation go?
Yeah, so it went in kind of two directions. So the one of the main goals of the Hells Angels is to acquire territory, and they acquire territory to do their drug and arms trafficking, right? So one of the I should back up and say that the way that these guys infiltrated the Mesa Bob chapter through Rudy, they assumed the identity of a real biker gang that was based in Tijuana. Okay, so the real biker gang were the Solo Angels. Okay, so their persona was, so they had sort of double identities, right? So their persona was they were a nomads, so they were sort of on their own in Arizona, and they were from this group based in Tijuana. So they created an interesting problem for themselves because they had to convince the Hells Angels that they had a connection to Tijuana. And so they needed to figure out a way that they could cross the border, go to Tijuana, have a meeting, and convince them that they were the real deal, that, these were the Solo Angels wanting to, be prospect for the Hells Angels and, kind of open, start a new chapter. And so, so that was part of their difficulty, was how they were going to go across international lines and convince the Hells Angels that they were legit. So that was a whole, like, almost story within a story. Then at some point, Rudy has to get extricated out of this group, and they can't just like have him disappear. They have to, figure out a way that he's going to leave their group gracefully, but they needed reinforcements in order to make the Hells Angels believe that they were a larger group of Solo Angels, right? So they needed reinforcements, and so the ATF was sending in new sort of reinforcement replacement recruits. So they had, not only this group of people, of novices, basically, they didn't know what they were doing. It was all improvisation. Now they had replacement recruits that came in, and they were just sort of placeholders to make themselves look larger than they actually were. So that was a really interesting sort of sidebar to their whole investigation.
Yeah.
But their ultimate goal, once they started to prospect, was they had to figure out what chapter they were going to, join. And so Bird's persona was so appealing that soon he had most of the Hells Angels chapters in Arizona wanting him to be a part of their chapter. So they were kind of stumbling over themselves to recruit them. But the deal was they had to recruit all of them. So they couldn't just recruit Bird, they had to recruit them as a group. And so that became a part of, how were they going to, so it was fun for the operatives in some sense, because they had, admiration, attention, people from all walks, from Tucson to, Prescott, all wanting them to join their chapter. And it was almost like a badge of honor for these chapters to have acquired, this group of nomad Solo Angels as their, inside their chapter. So that kind of consumed a lot of the investigation, or the infiltration, I should say. But ultimately, when they decided which group they were going to, prospect for, they now had to, it wasn't enough to just be a prospect. They wanted to be full patched members. So in order to be a full patched member, that was a whole nother level in this investigation. And they decided that they had to do something really extraordinary in order to really get inside and be accepted and become a full patch member. And I should say, for the listeners, there is a whole hierarchy within any biker group, but within the Hells Angels, there's a president, a vice president, a treasurer, a secretary, and there's the members, and the members are full patched, which means that, like in the mafia, you have like the made members, right? So in the biker world, they're the full patched members, which means that they have acquired the right or the privilege to wear the top and bottom rockers on their jacket and have the patch, which is the death head. So it's that coveted death head that you see on Hells Angels jackets. Cuts, they call them cuts.
The cuts. Yeah.
So that's sort of the short version. So they're wanting to acquire that status. So once they get that status, they then become what maybe your listeners are familiar with, a one percenter. So a one percenter in the biker world means that they are the 1% of motorcyclists that commit 99% of all crime. So they are one percenters. I like to call myself the 1% of true crime writers that will write about this kind of crime, because it's completely, off the radar of most true crime writers because of the, difficulty in navigating these worlds. But so that's a long answer to your question, but that's where they were headed, is to become full patch members.
Yeah, and for them to become full patch members, they really had to prove themselves. So I think they even formed like this fake hit, this whole murder that went down, and they took pictures and stuff, right?
Yes. So, yeah. So, in order to be accepted, one of the, I want to say one of the requirements, and there's a lot of debate as to whether or not this, I mean, I do know that this actually occurred. So, there's a moniker that Motorcycle Club means murder cult. Okay. So, one of the ways that you get in to becoming a full patch member is to commit a murder. So, of course, our operatives are not going to really do that. So they had to figure out a way that they could convince the Hells Angels that they had done this. Okay. And so there was a rumor among the Hells Angels that there was this wandering Mongol. Okay. The Mongols are the rivals of the Hells Angels, or many rivals, but that was one of the big rivals. And so, and by the way, when the Hells Angels acquire certain territories, they're always fighting other rival gang members for territory. So if a Mongol, enters Hells Angels territory, that's grounds to go after them, to eliminate them. Okay, so the operatives realized that in order to gain this privilege, becoming a full patch member, they had to commit a murder. So they devised a plot to commit a fake murder of a wandering Mongol in Magdalena. And so, so it couldn't just be anywhere. So they decided, how are we going to do that? They had to convince them that they had done this. So they devised a way. They got a jacket, a cut, Mongol cut, and they took a cow's stomach, and they put Pops, who is their one of the undercover operatives, or the undercover informants. They dug a ditch, they put him in it, they put the cuts on him, they put the cow's stomach on him, they made it look like he had been shot. And then they took pictures of it, and they wrapped up these pictures, and they put the bloody pictures of the cuts in a FedEx package. And they figured out a way to FedEx that package to the Hells Angels clubhouse. And so, so once they were able to open that package and realize what it was, that's when they accepted the group in as full patch members. So they bought the lie, the story within the story. So it was this whole very stressful moment of like, are they going to get caught? Are they going to be believed? If they're not going to be believed, they were, they had to be ready. The ATF had to be ready to come in and extricate them out. If it was going to be believed, it was going to be this huge ceremony. They were going to be full patch members, and that was going to be the pinnacle of their investigation, that they did it. They made it. They convinced the Hells Angels they'd done this murder, and now they were in, so.
Yeah, I mean that's a good way to answer that, because I don't even think, undercover agents, I don't, in the mob, I don't think they have ever were able to become made men, like ever had someone. They almost did, but for even bikers as well, that's a very hard task. That takes a lot of time, and they were able to do it in 18 months. Like you said, they were done. And I mean, now from interviews and stuff I've done with guys that got out of the life, and from what I researched too, is like now they have guys to be in, before they even make them a patch member or made member, they make them be in there for years and years, like 5 to 10 years or something. Who knows, just because of operations like this case. So
Right.
I'll go
Yeah,
ahead.
this case was, I mean, it really was extraordinary, not only because it was the first of its kind, but it was so creative. It was so well, even though improvised, it was very well orchestrated. And I think that really is a testament to Bird's genius, if you will, of how he was going to, I mean, his true gift in this was being able to really be that persona that he, espoused to be, because he was able to convince them. He had so much charm and charisma and, lived that part 24/7. And so, not without its repercussion, of course. I mean, there's a lot of toll that this world takes on the members. And I write about that in the book. I mean, they didn't come out of this unscathed. They were very successful in the sense that they were able to become, made members or full patch members. But at the end of the day, the charges didn't stick. There were other issues that happened that this case, this landmark criminal investigation, this incredible, and by the way, Operation Black Biscuit was the name given by beef. It was actually a hockey puck. It was like they needed to call it something. So they called it something that was completely innocuous that nobody would ever guess, so every step of the way was very creative and very, kind of monumental in that sense. And so the reason that the case is studied so much is because not only for how they manipulated, I mean, they really did a play within a play. They took on persona of a real fake biker gang to infiltrate a real gang, to commit a fake murder that was accepted so that they could become real made members. So all of that was extraordinary and fascinating in terms of how they did it and how they kept their cover. And then you bring in the female operative. I mean, all of those ingredients have not been duplicated since. So, people study that case and they say, so what went wrong? Well, I think what ultimately happened in that is sort of the end game of it. They had they wanted, I think the operatives, and this is actually pretty common for people that have lived undercover. It's like you become so immersed in that character because it is life or death. If you come out of character, you can be killed. So you really embody that world. You have to almost convince yourself that this is who you are so that you can stay alive. And so when you get so caught up in that world, it's very hard to gain perspective. And so here they are, they've become these made members, but now you've got the problem because they didn't actually kill a Mongol. And so the Hells Angels, are waiting to exact revenge on, this biker gang, right? So the prospect of an all-out biker war was very real. They couldn't fake a biker war, right? So
No.
now they had these pieces that, at the end of the day, were not going to add up. They were not going to, there's no way they could hold this big, I don't know, this big thing together, right? It was all going to unravel. And not only that, what do you do with JJ, right? I mean, you had the logistical issue of trying to keep her safe, making sure that she could be surveilled. So it became this really sort of larger than life investigation with these fallout issues that there wasn't a lot of, there wasn't really an effective way to handle that other than to end the investigation quickly, to end it, charge people, prosecute them. So you had that aspect of it where those cases, the 16 indictments of these, top leaders in the Hells Angels were pending trial. Then you had the civil asset forfeiture case where you go in and seize their clubhouse and all the paraphernalia and everything that, could provide them with further intelligence. So you had these two competing, areas where you wanted to really you wanted to get some kind of resolution, for this 18-month investigation. What do you get out of it? And unfortunately, they didn't get much out of it other than, something to study, because all of the indictments against the Hells Angels really fell apart. And they fell apart based on the actions of the informants. So it became this sort of legal nightmare for the operatives involved, for the cases. So it was a really, and I mean, the whole case was very interesting for all of those reasons, for the fallout, for the, what did it do to the lives of the operatives? I mean, JJ's life, or well, actually all of theirs, but Bird's life was, on the line. There was a contract hit put out on him. He was like on the run for almost 2 years. They burned down his house. They I mean, this was the fallout of this. So these were the kinds of things where, you can't really plan in advance for how that's going to happen. So you just sort of, it is improvisation, but you don't know how it's going to, what the end game is on this. And so, and the sad part is it didn't really cripple the organization. It wasn't a way to, bring down the Hells Angels. It just, I mean, I kind of equate it in a lot of respects to these sleeper cells. You can, if there had been indictments, if there had been, prosecutions, if people had actually done time, if there had been some actual results out of it, I still don't even think it would have crippled the main organization. They're too large. They're too systemic. But what did come out of it is we gathered intelligence. We learned who they were and who they are and who they continue to be. And so they're not this, innocuous group of people. They're not harmless. They're not, so that's maybe the end game, is to bring in education and information to who these motorcycle gangs are, and how they operate.
Yeah, and I think with anything really, any trying to infiltrate any kind of organization or trying to, just in general, ever trying to attempt to do something the first time. I mean, you have to learn, and it's not usually go to plan, but you just, like, I'm sure there's still investigations going on now with these groups, but they learned a lot from this when this occurred and what all you guys went through. I mean, you wrote the book, so details on what everybody went through and how it didn't go to plan the way that they wanted. But I think that there's always you got to start somewhere, and this is where the start began, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, I think that, I think it's really important to, to appreciate what they did, because I mean, they were the first, to do this. They didn't have a rule book. They didn't have, a way of even getting inside. I mean, very few people, I mean, Hunter Thompson did it in Hells Angels, but very few people had actually gotten into the inner sanctum of the largest international motorcycle gang in the world,
Yeah.
And so I think, regardless of some of the things that went wrong in this case, I think it's really important to appreciate what they did and how they did it. And they kind of, they were pioneers, and they kind of paved the way for other infiltrations. And they put the Hells Angels on the radar of, of the public. And they have this, the Hells Angels really, probably more than any other biker gang, have a very symbiotic relationship with the media. They have a public and private persona. And I think that one of the things this infiltration did was really sort of, in a lot of ways, maybe tarnish that, public persona, which is effective in the long run, where people are now kind of, okay, maybe they're not just these harmless, motorcycle enthusiasts that are out there, running charities like Toys for Tots, maybe there's something else we should be taking a look at, and see, like, what are they actually involved in? What are they actually doing? And so, and so I think for those reasons, I mean, these infiltrations are important, and I think we can't really lose sight of, the good that this infiltration did, so maybe it didn't have like the perfect end result, having all of these, bringing down an organization, or crippling it, or, jailing the leaders. Because, the sad thing is, I mean, when you have an organization, it's like any terror group, really, there are going to be, new cells, new recruits, people that are coming, to task. I mean, they're very insidious in that respect. So I think it's just important to have that insight and have that information. And, that's what we can take away from Operation Black Biscuit.
Yeah, no, I think so too, because I mean, we have to have the history. We got to have the books, and I think that that was a good idea that they approached you to do this for them as it was going on, because it's something in history now. It don't go away. It's always going to be there, and people can reference it a lot, especially a lot of law enforcement if they want to continue to do operations. Like you said, use it like a study book, like you would use in history class in high school or something. It's just something that's always going to be there. So I mean, for them to choose you, I mean, they they must have really wanted you to do it, because they were pretty persistent on having you do it. They finally got you to do it.
Yeah, or I was just, an easy mark. I don't know at this point.
Well, you eventually
Yeah.
went in and did it. I mean, but you think too. I mean, I did make a note that when the case was over, they did get a bunch of arsenal and illegal weapons. They gathered 650 fully automatic firearms, machine guns, silencers, and bombs, and a bunch of ammo. And then they had all their bug conversations. But there was a lot of stuff that they were able to get, and prove that, hey, they're not just this biker club. They look at all these guns and bombs. Why do they have this for biking, for being bikers? You know what I mean?
Right.
You're able to really show that there's more than what there is to what they're saying and what they're portraying to the public, because it's even in mafia boss cases as well. I mean, they fed they gave people turkeys and stuff, on Thanksgiving. I think Al Capone even had a homeless shelter or some food kitchen, and that was their public persona. But you brought to life what it was like for these operatives to go through there, and what these organizations that they were dealing with in particular were really involved with.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I think that was really the goal, is to bring an awareness on it. I mean, it's otherwise they really do sort of live under the radar, very much like the mafia. I mean, I learned a lot about, I've written five biker books since then, and
Damn.
have covered all of the major, the big five, they call them. And, in a lot of respects, they're structured very similarly, but depending on where they are in the country, they have a relationship with the mob. And I think it's very interesting, the hierarchy there, where the
Yeah.
mob uses some of the biker gangs as their foot soldiers, biker gangs recruit street gangs as their foot soldiers. So, everybody's they all have a role, and they're all like doing each other's dirty work. So I think it's really fascinating that whole, it's sort of the underworld of what's going on. And I think, for most people, maybe that's a good thing, but for most people, they're not really aware that this is going on, all around them, but sort of undercover.
Yeah. Well, what are the other books that you've read? What's the titles of those? The other five that you've written
So
after?
I wrote Prodigal Father, Pagan Son, which was about the pagans, and they're in Philadelphia mostly, and they're a rival of the House Angels. And then I wrote Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, infiltrations into those, and that involved Charles Falco, who was still, I think, probably the most famous government infiltrator there is. And then I wrote The Last Chicago Boss, about the godfather of the Chicago Outlaws. So I got to learn a lot about, how the outlaws operate. And it's very interesting because in each one of the books, they sort of, they, the characters sort of come alive in each one of the books, because they all have a relationship with each other. Like
Yeah.
Charles Falco appeared in the clubhouse that is featured in The Last Chicago Boss. So it's interesting. I mean, I've really learned a lot about that world and that subculture, and and at times it's pretty horrifying, but it's also really interesting to kind of know that that's actually going on around us.
Yeah. I mean, so this book was like your stepping stone into doing more and more about the whole biker scene. and what really goes on with all these. So you did end up going and covering some other guys' stories, like they approached you or you approached them, kind of deal.
Yeah, so it was very interesting. I mean, my whole foray into writing true crime was very unexpected. And I think, Running with the Devil took a huge toll on me as a writer and as a lawyer. It really, I think, forever changed that landscape. But, surprisingly, I did. I got recruited by other bikers. I mean, for Prodigal Father, Pagan Son, I was recruited by LT, who is the star of that book. He was raised in an organized crime family. His father was the founder of the Pagans. And and he was recruited by his father's nemesis to murder his father. So it was a really interesting story. They're all a little bit different. The Charles Falco, who infiltrated the Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, and they have subsequently made a television show on it. It's called Gangland Undercover. But he also found me and asked me to write his story. And then the godfather of the Chicago Outlaws approached me and asked me to write his story. And it was just kind of crazy having these, like, every Sunday we would sit, have conversations for 3 hours. And, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I am talking to probably the most dangerous person that I've ever talked to in the Outlaws. I mean, he was absolutely a godfather, 100%. And, and charming. And, I mean, he would send me, boxes of Godiva chocolate, long stem roses, like 6-foot tall roses, and and then one time he sent me this giant Chicago pizza in a like almost like a styrofoam refrigerator box. It arrived on my doorstep. I thought, so, I mean, I was definitely, like, in his mind, he was the godfather hiring somebody to write his story, and he treated me like somebody, he once told me, he said, well, it'd be like if you did a performance at the opera, I need to. So, yeah, it was a very interesting world to be in there, so I've seen it from both sides. I've seen it from the government infiltrations to the people that are actually in it, that are orchestrating the hits and the, the crazy things. Yeah. Yeah. And that, just as an aside, it's kind of an interesting fine line as a lawyer too, because I always have to tell, it's happened in Prodigal Father, Pagan Son, I have to tell people, I'm not their lawyer. I can be subpoenaed. I can be, I mean, I had the FBI come and ask me questions about one of the books I wrote,
Really?
one of
You
the
actually
characters
did?
in the books, because it involved an unsolved murder. And, so I mean, like, so there was that fine line where I'm always having to tell them, I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. And so, if you want to tell me something, I mean, they always had a say in what was going to be published and how the book was finally going to come out. I never would publish anything that they were not sanctioning. So,
I think it's
but
smart they hired a lawyer to write their book, because you think of a lot of these stories these guys tell, all kinds of different crime guys, they can get in trouble if they say the wrong things. You know what I mean? So
absolutely.
having them go to you is probably the best bet.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't really actually realize that till much later, but I thought, it actually probably is pretty smart, because I do understand. I mean, obviously I navigate the court system, the legal system. I know what is going to get them in trouble. So if they tell me something, I mean, a lot of times I'll just say, I'm not putting that in the book. That's not going in the book, because it's going to incriminate you. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it's very interesting that way. And at one point, one of my books, I had to keep a bank vault, where I put a lot of, secretive kind of confidential information in there. But, they always knew that if something came to pass where I had to be, subpoenaed, that, I was obviously going to testify. So it was,
Yeah.
it was that
They
fine
just let them
line.
know. Yeah, you had that line with them, that barrier, whatever you have to. Because I mean, when
Yeah,
it comes down to it, that's what you are. You're a lawyer, right? I mean,
right.
you do that and write all these books.
I still do it. Yeah, I do it less now, but I still do criminal defense. And I'm in a position where I can pick and choose a lot of the cases, So when I'm writing a book, oftentimes I will do less work on the light legal side, because writing a book is like an entire case, it
Yeah.
takes years to research and write. And but yeah, I mean, I find both arenas really interesting. I mean, I think if the book world ever overtook the legal world, I would be really grateful for that.
Yeah.
But
So yeah, I mean, that's cool that you're able to do both and be able to, keep up with both of them and really do what you enjoy, what you really love doing, and that's what's
yeah,
important. I think that's what a lot of people can get from listening to your story. I mean, yeah, you wrote all these cool books, but I mean, your life story is pretty interesting as well about being able to make it out of being in like a lawyer position and being able to write books as well. So that's cool. I mean, it just shows you whatever you want to do, you put your mind to it, you can do it.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I've heard from a lot of lawyers, it's not that uncommon that lawyers will say that they're writing a book, or they want to be a writer, but many of them will wait till they retire to
Yeah.
write that book. And I'm like, I'm not that kind of person. I'm like, you got to live now because none of us is guaranteed tomorrow, and I think there's always time in the day. And I once pointed out to somebody, I'm like, it's sort of like if you want to save for something, you're not going to go buy that, $5, $10 Starbucks, whatever it is. Right. So if you want to write that book, if you really want to do the thing that you love, you're going to find time for it. There's 24 hours in a day. So you like sleep less, or,
Yeah.
you cut out the television show you want to watch on Netflix, unless it's mine. So I'm like,
Yeah, no, that's true. No, I mean, it just shows you take advantage of the little time that we have, and you can make a lot happen because you wrote
yeah,
quite a few books now while
yeah.
still being a lawyer.
That's right, exactly. It's exhausting. I'm tired a lot, but
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on my show and sharing your stories and really giving people motivation on just life and achieving their goals and stuff that they want to do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
Who knew there was so much more to these biker clubs than what we know? Kerrie is a very great speaker and author. Please comment any key takeaways that you got from this interview. Please share it with anyone that you think will enjoy this type of content. Kerrie's book will also be in the video description. Again, I highly recommend this book if you enjoyed this interview. She goes into very much more detail on there about this story about these undercover agents infiltrating the biker club. Please subscribe to my channel for more interviews like this, and at the end of this video a playlist will pop up of all my other interviews. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.